In this video, we discuss how your current savings behavior may very well be warning you about your life ahead in retirement. Coming up next on Holy Schmidt.
Holy Schmidt!
There are a lot of factors that happen today that affect your retirement savings if they're done wrong or if they're done at the wrong time. The first is low and or inconsistent savings. Let me explain. Sometimes we struggle to save enough for retirement because we have things we have to pay for. But there are a few of them that are warning signs that you really need to pay attention to. The first is if you're carrying a credit card balance and therefore you have to pay the credit card balance instead of saving more for retirement. The fact is, if you're paying 16, 17, 18, 21% for your credit card and you can't get anything into a savings account or an investment account, more likely for most of you, you're going to get way behind. The next is if you're living paycheck to paycheck. This is because you have no wiggle room to save. And the fact is, it doesn't take much to get out of the cycle of paycheck to paycheck, but it does take a little bit every single month until you've built up enough reserves so that you can start to do other things, because ultimately, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, the bills do get paid with the same money, it's just when you pay them. The next is if you delay or skip retirement contributions. The fact is, if you are not putting money into your retirement account today, it becomes much harder in the future to catch up. That's just the math behind the time value of money. So even if you think skipping just this one time is okay, it's never just one time. It's usually 1 year or 2 years or 3 years or 10 years in some cases. You get the point. The next is if you have frequent overdrafts or low account balances. The fact is, those are both warning signs that you don't have the funds to invest, of course, because if you did, you wouldn't be overdrafting your checking account. On the other side, if you are varying your deposits into your savings, depending on what the value is in your checking account this month, that's a warning sign. And also not reaching your savings milestones, that's a warning sign as well. By the way, when I say savings, I mean savings and or putting money into an investment vehicle like a 401k. The next is frequent withdrawals with things that shouldn't be frequently withdrawn upon, like, for example, your emergency fund to fund day-to-day activity. And if you're using your savings for everyday expenses, well, that's not a good sign either. And feeling constantly financially stressed or insecure, well, if you have that feeling and it's been going on for a long period of time, it's time to take stock of this particular point. Next is if you don't have an emergency fund. Now, the primary purpose of an emergency fund is to deal with emergencies, of course. And so therefore, not having one means that when something big happens, and something big happens at the worst time sometimes, then you have to find other means to pay for it, including more debt. Having no emergency fund means that you might not have the ability to manage healthcare costs in the future, because they can be quite variable. Some doctors don't take insurance. They force you to submit and then get reimbursed. Others are happy to just take the insurance and you pay the copay. But sometimes you don't know who is who until the situation presents itself. Having no emergency fund means that you also run a big chance of having to tap into your retirement funds. That's a huge warning sign, by the way, because retirement funds are there for retirement. And of course, the last point is that without an emergency fund, you have a very limited ability to help loved ones in an emergency. The next point is having minimal investment growth. Maybe you're just too conservative on your investments and you can't keep pace. A good example is if you put your money in a CD, or if you put your money in a CD 3 or 4 years ago when inflation was at 1.5% to 2%, and then it skyrocketed, but you were locked in at 3%, well, you just lost a lot of money. This last point alone means that you may have insufficient growth to support your retirement needs, and frankly, you may outlive your funds in retirement. It also means that you'll probably have a greater reliance on Social Security and also your pension. What this all points to is that you'll have a difficult time maintaining a certain standard of living in retirement, and after all, that's the entire purpose for you to save for retirement so that you can enjoy those years of your life. The next behavior is delaying savings and investing because you always have tomorrow, the mañana syndrome. And of course, the problem with that is that mañana never comes. And I'm sure you've seen the example, because we've all seen the example, where if you put a certain amount of money in your retirement account at age 20, or you put 2 times that in the account at age 30, you'll end up with a lot less at the end of your working years. So in a nutshell, what that means is that delaying savings means that you have to save more, a lot more, later to be at the same level. It also means that you'll have fewer investment options, at least for a segment of your retirement, because as you approach retirement, most people de-risk their investment portfolio. So if you would have had 20 years of the higher growth, higher risk investments, but now you only have 15, well, by definition, that means that you don't enjoy those 5 extra years of big growth, or potential big growth anyway. And of course, there's the employer match, which is supremely important with your 401k. And if you're not contributing, well, then you may not have a employer contribution, or if you do, it's not the full contribution. The final point is that you'll have less cushion, less tolerance for market volatility. The reason's simple, because as you approach retirement, your investments become very real to you, but they aren't that real when you're in your 20s and even your early 30s. What was this thing that was off in the distant future is now right around the corner, and people tend to get a lot more conservative when they think they might need the funds very, very soon. The next warning point is if you are heavily relying or solely relying on Social Security as your primary source of income or only source of income in retirement. According to the Social Security Administration, just under 40% of retirees out there live on Social Security alone. So 4 out of 10, that's a huge number. But if you're watching this video right now, I'm sure it's your intention not to be one of those 4. But for someone who is relying almost entirely on Social Security, let me just point out 3 points. The first is that depending on how old you are, you could be vulnerable to policy changes. For example, we know that in 2034, the Social Security Trust will be depleted. There are going to be some changes along the way, very, very likely, to make sure that that doesn't happen. And depending on what side of the retirement line you are, those changes may affect you, they may not affect you. But the reality is, if you're relying on Social Security alone, you may not, probably don't have a safety net for emergencies because every dollar you make is supremely important to you. And the last point is that your healthcare costs probably aren't fully covered because having Social Security in place doesn't mean that you have free health insurance, free deductibles, free copays, and free other costs associated with medical care in retirement. And the next point is very obvious, and that is ignoring inflation. That's a very bad thing to do with someone's current savings behavior or their investing behavior, because inflation, as we all know, can eat away at big portions of the things we use to cover our costs later. And the reality is inflation doesn't just announce itself and therefore you change the way that you react. Inflation creeps up on you a little bit at a time. If you think back a few years ago when we were running 8% inflation, it didn't feel like 8% at the beginning of the year. It may have felt like 8% at the end of the year. This was 2022, but certainly not at the beginning of the year. Things just slowly get harder and harder. And because of that, it creeps up on you. You don't know why in particular. You think you know why because you've been reading the newspaper, but you haven't experienced it viscerally. Inflation erodes purchasing power, of course, but also your fixed income investments lose value because if you have a old treasury bond that you bought 5 years ago that has a 3% interest rate, but you can buy a new one today for 5%, well, with the same $100, you 10 times out of 10 buy the 5% one versus the 3% one. Well, the only way to sell your treasury bond with a 3% yield is to sell it at a discount. Ignoring inflation means that you're ignoring the fact that the cost of living has gone up, not just with things like food or medicine, but everywhere. And again, you won't feel it until you feel it. And one of the biggest areas that you'll feel it, and it is supremely painful if you don't get it right, is healthcare costs. So that's something that you need to manage very, very closely. And the last warning sign is that you don't have a financial plan, which means that you don't know what your goals are for 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, or 36 months out or beyond. Having a retirement plan is supremely important. In fact, out of everything we've talked about in this video, this could be number one, because without a plan, you're just throwing money in a bucket and hoping that it gets you to where you want to go. A plan is very specific and quite realistic in most cases, particularly if you're working with a financial planner, a fiduciary, someone who has your best interest at heart. They will put together a plan for you that's realistic, and they'll help you get to where you want to go. So how do you correct this? Well, if some of the list or all of the list applies to you, just systematically start doing the things that we talked about, and that will get you a lot closer, and the warning signs will start to subside. This is Jeff Schmidt. Thanks for watching.